Okay, picking up where we left off, we talked about the execute bit. Normally the execute bit would be to turn on permission to execute something, but we're not ready to demo that now. But in our case of a directory, it's fairly common that you want this pass-through feature so that you're allowed, if I don't have read permission on a directory, but I do have read permission on the file, I want to be able to still go through that guy to get to him. So X means pass through. It doesn't mean execute when dealing with directories. Cool? Okay. We talked about the set user ID and the set group ID before. This is the S in the listing. We have one there for test 8. By the way, isn't it fairly obvious that the fact that they made that sucker in bright red, that they really, really think that set user ID and set group ID is kind of a dangerous thing? Yeah. In fact, if you were to go through and do a search, I'm not certain that you would find hardly any set UID and set GIDs in Ubuntu out of the box, because it's a great way of doing things. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying the security risks are just enormous, because if I accidentally gave you write permission on something with the set UID bit on, then you could go in there and add whatever command you want. The next time I clicked on it, it would do your bidding rather than mine. Okay, I'm just saying that it's kind of sort of dangerous. So they mark it with red. Kind of cool. All right, we've talked about that before, so I'm just going to move on. I'm going to skip the changing of the permissions because we've already done that in the other book. Okay, cool. And move on to access control list on page 140. Okay, there's an alternative to those 9 RWXs, RWX, the 9 bits. There's some alternatives to it because, as I mentioned before, it was great in its day. But by today's standard, man, not having nested groups is a pain in the ass. So there's 2 major choices. There's one called the POSIX version of this. And then, believe it or not, one of the alternatives for instead of using the permissions like we've set up, you can actually use the NTFS, that's the network file system, NTFS version 4 from Microsoft. And that works great, particularly if you're trying to set permissions where most of your machines in the office are Windows and you have a handful of machines that are Linux machines. Wouldn't it be kind of cool if you could just kind of close your eyes and set the group permissions up exactly the same? Yeah, that would be kind of nice. Anyway, we're not going to do that. But when you do have that feature enabled, there'll be a little plus sign at the end of the directory listing, basically telling you, okay, the directory permissions or file permissions that you see are not really here. They're actually stored someplace else. So a little plus sign shows up. Okay. Thank goodness we're not going to demo that. But we're ready to move on to Chapter 6. Okay. So Chapter 6 is all about software. Now, we have been doing this, okay? We've been using the apt-get command. Okay. So starting on page 153, they talk about the typical admin functions. Yeah, like some of the things you would be expected to do. Automating the mass install of operating system. Yay! Maintaining custom configurations. Keeping track of updates. Tracking software licenses. And basically managing add-on software. Now, there's some terms here. One called localization. So localization means I have tweaked the configuration of Linux so that my version of Linux is slightly different than the store-bought version. Okay. Now, the problem is localization has been used in lots of other contexts. For example, if you go to Microsoft's site and you type in localization, what that means is I want to make my program run in a different language, the language of the operating system itself. In other words, if I have a French version of Windows 10 and I install my app, I want the app to come up in French. That's their version of localization. That is not what we're talking about here. I'm just telling you, the 2 words are used a lot. Unfortunately, in the Linux world, it talks about I'm tweaking the configuration from the store-bought. Okay, so how do we install Linux on page 154? Well, we've done this. Yay! Typically, you'd boot from a USB or a floppy drive or a mounted ISO file in our case. And it's kind of easy, right? I mean, we did it. It wasn't that complicated. You ask a couple of questions, you just go through it, hit the button, kind of done. One of the other things you can do is what's called a live boot. I can boot up off the CD-ROM and not install anything at all, but actually just run Linux off of the CD-ROM. I don't even have to have a hard drive at all. Maybe I pulled my hard drive out. Could I still run Linux off the CD-ROM? Yep, I certainly can. So this thing called the live boot is a very cool way of doing business, particularly if you've got, like, for example, you screwed up the FS tab file and you went, oh man, my machine won't boot. You know, I'm screwed. Well, fine. Do a live boot. Now, when you do a live boot, it's not going to mount that root file read-write. You're going to have to go in and tell it, okay, I want to remount that guy's write. Then you go down to the etc., go to FS tab, edit it, fix the thing you want to do, save the changes, back up, unmount the guy, reboot, you're up and running again. Okay, so having a live boot is like a lifeboat for a lot of people, so it's pretty doggone cool. So what about unattended installs? I want to install the software. I got 7 brand new machines that just came in, and they're sitting in cardboard boxes. All I really want to do is just take them out of the cardboard box, plug them into the network, turn them on, and walk off. That's what I want to do. How do you do that? Well, there is a way. And this is the same kind of a system that we use in the Windows world, using what's called the pre-boot execution environment, PXE. Most business class machines, not gaming rigs, but, Dell and HP and, those guys who make machines for business, built in, when you boot the machine up, it's going to hit the network and try to see if there's somebody out there who wants to send them a configuration file or an OS image, okay, called the pre-boot execution environment. Now, this obviously has to be supported by the BIOS on the machine, plus a minor tweak or two to the actual network card. So, again, your machine at home may or may not have it's called Pixie Boot, PXE, may not have Pixie Boot capability, but practically all the machines you buy for business do have Pixie Boot. Okay, it takes a hell of a lot of moving parts to pull this thing off. Here's a goofy little diagram of that. So here's what happens. So I have a machine over here, and it says, hey man, I need I sent a DHCP request. And so some server, which has already been configured to do this, says, hey, here's where you go to get your operating system. And it says, great. And TFTP stands for Trivial File System Transport, File System Protocol. I can't say that. File Transfer Protocol. Phew. Anyway, so the machine says, fine, thank you. So it says, go here to get this OS image. It says, okay. So it gets the OS image. It gets the OS image and the configuration file. And then it says, okay, I kind of got that. Now I'm ready to start. So it says, go get the image, serve the image, and then boot. Boom. So it's kind of complicated. It takes lots of moving parts. And clearly you had to have set this up in advance to make this thing work, right? Okay, cool. All right. So let me get back to the screen I was on. Not that there was anything going on there, but that's beside the point. So how do you set up a PXE? There is actually, it's not hard to do, but there's actually what called Pixie Linux, which is download this little doodad and it does it all. You could just use the standard, DHCP configuration. There's another one called Cobbler, which you can use to set up the configuration files. So there's lots of techniques you can use to set this thing up. So, in order for this to be an unattended install, so during the install of this thing, I don't want it. The machine asked a lot of questions, didn't it? Right? It asked, what do you want to call a machine? Tons of questions. So, in order for this to be unattended, I have to have what's called an answer file. An answer file basically says every time you ask me a question, go here to get the answer. Okay, so it's just a text file that contains the list of all the answers. The answer might be yes and 12 and 42. Just whatever it is. Okay, so on page 159, I'm skipping a little bit. They talk about the Debian installer. So there's a thing called dbconfig that you can use as that answer file. So there's one called, it's called preceding, seed file and a pre-seed file. I don't know. Anyway, it's a precede.cfg file, which is where the answer file is kept. And you can actually make one of these during the install. You can set it up so that instead of you remembering all the questions and what all the answers were, you can basically tell it to record those things. So during the install, every question got asked got recorded, and every answer got recorded, and it got recorded in this thing. So that when you're done, you say, okay, now I'm going to do it on the second machine. You could just hand it this precede CFS, and it won't ask you for anything. Woohoo! I'm going to skip over the talk about net booting with Cobbler and a bunch of other junk. Basically, it's just a self-contained way of doing Pixie booting. Okay, moving along to page 162, they talk about managing packages. So one of the things we talked about in the very beginning, in fact, it was kind of before we started talking about assignment 1, was one of the defining factors in choosing a Linux distribution was what type of package management system does it use. Okay. Now, in the old days, what you did is you sent out source code. And because everyone who had Unix was also a C programmer. I know, isn't that crazy? Yes, in the old days, everyone who had Linux also had skills for writing programs in C. Yeah. So you would send out what's called a tarball. It's a tar is a tape archive, and then a compressed tape archive. It's like a backup file, and you compress it and send the guy. So you would uncompress it, take it out of the tar, take it out of like a zip file, and then you would compile the application, and you'd be up and running. You'd be on your own. Cool. But obviously that didn't last very long because not everyone is a skilled C compiler person. Don't know the language, don't care. So that is not a viable option for non-programmers. So hence the packages. Okay, so packages have some tremendous advantages, right? First of all, you don't have to have any skill. So packages, one of the cool things it's supposed to do is it will not overwrite any of the existing configuration settings. So if you have configuration settings already in place, it's not going to whack anything while it starts to do its install. And it should be able to detect any dependencies. Like if you're, for example, you're installing NFS, and it says, whoa, you're missing some network component. It's like, okay, fine, whatever. It'll go get it and put it in there and install it along with the package. So you just tell it what you want, and it'll figure out what the dependencies are. And it can run all sorts of scripts because, for example, maybe it needs to install a group, create a group or add people to group membership. For example, when we did the VirtualBox extensions, it did lots of things. It created a group, it created a user, it put some people in there, lots of things. And then it supports localization. Which localization am I talking about? Okay. So in the old days, there was a thing called a deb file, and that was the Debian file. So we don't actually use deb files anymore, but it could be. So the two major choices in the world are the what's called the RPM package manager. Okay, now RPM doesn't actually stand for anything. It actually originally stood for Red Hat package management, but now it's not Red Hat. It's just RPM. So RPM package manager. So Red Hat and CentOS and those guys are the ones who use that. And so their low-level command to be able to get to the GRUDY is RPM, and their high-level command to be able to get to things. High level meaning, I want to do something very, very specific, so I go to the low level command to do something. And then the high level command, which gives you a little bit more options, a little bit cleaner, maybe a little bit more options and easier to use, is called YUM. Y-U-M. Okay. In our world, we're using Advanced Package Toolkit, APT. And our low level is called apt-get. Well, not just get. There's apt, lots of things. But apt-get is the typical one that we've been using. And the higher level one is APT. Cool. All right. This is probably a good place to start for the 15-minute mark. You know how this works.